So I think you all know that, and I'm going to admit this, it's true confessions time. I'm not a fisherman. I may fish, man, when I was a kid, I probably fished some rivers, but I'm not a fisherman. And my background is that I started sailing tall ships in 1978, and then I sailed tall ships for the next 30 years. And then for the last 10 years, I've been teaching kids, high school kids, how to build boats up in Port Townsend, Washington. This is a little story from the Eye of the Wind, which was about a 130-foot brigantine, and we were traveling around in the South Pacific. And this happened to me in the early 80s. By the Mark 10, the man at the cathead shouted back. The first toss of the lead as we entered the reef into Langa Langa Lagoon. Mark 10, the skipper answered. Suddenly we heard the drums sounding in the jungle, and out of the bush people came running and launching pirogues, hundreds of them. They were jumping, paddling towards us, screaming, shouting, and onward we carefully motored. From forward. Deep 8, replied aft. Our procedure for any reef entrance was that there was a sailor on the cross trees with a radio, Ray-Bans, and binoculars, and another one up forward with a lead line. Then a person at the helm, the engineer by the controls, and Captain Tiger Timms, the skipper, at the rail, orchestrating it all. We were in the tropics, and usually you could see the coral heads 100 feet down and a half a mile away, but not today. Getting murky ahead, from aloft on the radio, and the water began to stain brown. By now the canoes were circling the boat, and everybody was shouting to us in a primitive tongue, and luckily they were laughing, like we were the most funny thing they had ever seen in their lives. 10:30 from forward. And suddenly dozens of sing-song voices of the children said, 10:30, laughing like crazy. From aloft, murkier still, I can't see diddly. And the canoes were touching the hulls now. Nobody on board, damn it, said Tiger, and then slow ahead. We were halfway down the channel, entering Langa Langa Lagoon on Maleta Island in the Solomon Island group. The Solomons, hot equatorial hell, a place where you don't dare to get a scratch because it won't heal for weeks. Actually, it'll never heal until you leave the Solomons. It just festered and oozed even though you cared for it every day. And nothing worked. Everybody had their own plans. Some were covered with iodine, others with tincture of purple. Some covered it, some uncovered it. Some had salves, powders, but nothing worked. We walked around with various colors and bandages, the walking wounded, praying not to get another scratch. The Solomon Islands, forgotten islands. Nobody cared about them, and they didn't welcome Papalangi. Their people didn't, their diseases didn't, not even their charts did. Often like this one, Langa Langa Lagoon, it had a big blank in the patch that just said uncharted, and might have well said, there be the dragons. The charts we had were last updated in World War II. Aloft. Mark 6, Tiger. Damn, we need a local guide. Tim, you got a lot of choices out here, for better or for worse. The Solomons. If the Solomons were bad, then Maleta was the devil of the Solomons. Maleta was the last place known to practice cannibalism. And the boys from Maleta were feared by the rest of the islanders. In Honiara, if there was a fight, you can bet the boys from Maleta were involved, and usually with machetes. More canoes. Mark 5. Mark 5! All the children screamed. Tiger. Damn, we need a local. That turn is soon. The coffee-colored water rolled by us. Neutral. Tim, see what you can find us. Tim, the big Aussie mate, went amidships and said, English. Anybody speak English? His voice was like a canoe magnet. People started jostling to get on board. No, nobody on board. He signaled and he pushed the people back. English, anybody speak English? He shouted out. The people didn't understand. They just shook their heads and they laughed. No one spoke English. As opposed to Polynesia, where the islanders had similar languages throughout thousands of miles, a place like Malta might have 40 languages and dialects on one island. Highlanders didn't speak to coast people. They didn't talk to reef people. It was all too dangerous. And maybe 1% in the whole chain spoke English. "Hey, me!" we heard from a canoe in the crowd. And somebody signaled, and slowly he paddled in. He nosed against the hull. "I speak English." "What's your name?" "John." "Where'd you learn?" "Mission in Honiara. Me good man, mission man, for many years." "All right, John, come on board. But tell everybody else, nobody on board." And we yanked him over the bulwarks. "John, you know these waters?" "Yes, sir. That's my home village." "What about down Lagoon?" He furrowed his brow. "Why you want to go down Lagoon?" "You know the way?" Now, no bullshit now. We want a good guide. I know one." "Does he speak English?" "No." "Can you find him?" "Can you two go down Lagoon with us?" Well, let me find him first." "And can you get us to a safe anchorage and quiet from all these people?" "Yes, sir, just down around the corner." And John shouted out to his friends. They go get him. Tim walked back. "I think I got us a man. But we need his mate to come as a pilot." "Bloody well, it better be okay. This place makes me jumpy," said Tiger. What were we doing here? This was Captain Tiger Tim's obsession. He loved old National Geographic magazines, and he'd see something weird and wonderful from, say, 1936 Irving Johnson article, and boom, we'd be off trying to find it. We saw young men diving out of trees with vines on their legs in Vanuatu. We saw lost Polynesian clans like Tikapia and Kapinga-Marangi. We went up active volcanoes, lost wrecks. And this time, we were seeking the shark haulers of Langa Langa Lagoon. Later at anchor, just after dusk, John's friend who came on board, he was also called John. Of course, this was only their name for us. So we had Pilot John and Talking John from then on. Now, Pilot John spoke no English, but Talking John convinced us that Pilot John could take us down Lagoon, though they had some kind of hidden puzzlement why anybody would want to do that, as if it was a very unwise thing to do. We left at dawn the next day. Now, if God made breakfast in an enormous cast iron skillet, and then he filled it with dirty water, and then he left it on the wood stove to simmer just below boil, well, you'd be describing the Solomon Islands. The sun came up and you ran for shade. Luckily, the boat had awnings from bow to stern for a day like this, and we motored down that breathless lagoon. Now, when I say lagoon, I don't want you to think about Bora Bora. I don't want you to think about some beautiful coral atoll. Think about a wide channel and the landside swamp and lowland, and then a vertical rise into a steep, dense jungle. And then on the other side, the reef, many low islands, coconut trees, and sand. And there were breaks in the reef pass every few miles. And the highland rivers would run off dark and murky, and they battled with a clean flow from the tide. They were constantly at war. Aloft, I stood with the radio and Pilot John, and below, after deck, was Talking John, Tiger Tim's, and the mate at the helm. Forward, another mate, lead in hand, another hand on the anchor brake, and the engineer stood by the throttle, and we were all tense as cats on the hunt. We passed villages, and sometimes we'd hear drumming, and then we'd smell the wood smoke from the frond fires, and to the left, the darkness, and on the right, the blazing brightness of the sand and the reflected sea. And down Lagoon we crept. And about 3 o'clock, Pilot John gave the word, "No further today, we anchor here." "Why?" Something about being too far, no more good anchorages, blah, blah, blah. Who really knows? But Talking John said this village was friendly, and the Johns would take us ashore if we wanted to. No one was interesting while the sun was up, and most were afraid once the sun was down. Everybody was wrung out like a dirty tea towel. The heat, the tension, the thick moist air, the sores we all carried. So in true British fashion, we went for tea. After dark, Tim and I went ashore with the Johns, no other takers. Talking John said, "Papalangi here." And he took us to a hut with a boat alongside it. And there a white woman sat with a fire, and she was stirring a pot. "I heard there was a boat here," she said in an Aussie accent. I didn't believe it. Nobody comes here. She was in her 20s or so, I guess, in a very light, dirty, worn-out lava-lata, and she looked incredibly tired. "What are you doing here?" we asked. She tossed her head back towards the hull of a 20-something foot boat, a hull underway, planked, no paint, no caulking. "Well, Jack and I heard we could get a hull here built cheaply. You know, native builder on the beach, all very romantic. We've been here for 3 years. We're out of money, native politics, promises. You know, we're kind of trapped, kind of a slave to it all." "Well, where's your partner?" "Off fishing, you know, must eat. He's kind of gone native." "Well, no." "Oh, Christ, who knows anymore?" "Can we give you a lift out of here?" "Nah, we got to see it through. Although I wonder if sometimes we'll ever get out of here alive." And she went back to her stirring, studying her brew as intently as if she was reading tea leaves. We moved on. Not much to see. A row of pandanus huts, eyes in the bush, eyes in the doorways, strange tongues, the giggles of children you never saw. The Johns were gone. So we went back to the beach and we radioed for a pickup. The next morning, the Johns were sleeping on the foredeck, and dawn came, and the merciless sun hit, and we carried on. It clouded in around noon, thankfully a slight drizzle, and about an hour later, Pilot John became very animated. He pointed, and he gave me the radio. Talking John says, "We anchor behind that islet on the right side of the reef pass. That island ahead, that next one, that is it." Steve dropped the hook, and we climbed down from the top, so we met on the afterdeck. "Why not anchor right behind the island?" No, not right. We must get permission first. This is a sacred place." We sent Tim ashore with the Johns across the reef pass to the island ahead. They were gone a couple hours. Finally, they came back. Tim filled us in. I met with the local high priest. "They'll do it. They'll call the sharks tomorrow. They'll send us a sign. It happens right there on that point on the other side of the reef pass, but it'll cost us." "What do they want?" Tiger asked. He was always the master trader. 6 cartons of cigs, 2 cases of beer, a bottle of whiskey, and 6 bush knives. "Easy," Tiger said. "We'll bring them when we come. Take them a carton of cigs now, 2 machetes. Oh, yeah. And find out if we can shoot this reef pass with the ship. Looks doable to me. Wayne, you go sound it." We all rested somewhat easier, but in great anticipation of the next day. The next morning, we watched for the signal. It was to be a great puff of smoke. And all morning, we could see 3 men on the point. They'd walk from their little hut to the shore, sometimes with their arms outstretched, sometimes tossing things into the sea, sometimes chanting, stomping. It went on for hours. And around 11, Talking John, who was watching like a dog on the point, said, There, we go." We loaded the inflatables and we landed. We landed on the large islet, and there was a smaller one that connected to a bridge. We were directed to that big islet. We followed the Johns onto a bridge, and there an older man stopped us, shook his head and gestured. John says, "Women can't see this sacred ceremony." Of course, our party was half women. Tiger went forward with his backpack. He produced 2 more cartons of cigarettes. "Tell him that these are Papalangi women, so they don't count." And the old man thought about it and says, "You're right." We crossed over the bridge, and there was a small pandanus hut in the islet's center, and 2 older men and a younger man were there. They were the priests. Then just inside the reef pass, the water was swarming with sharks. Now, I mean hundreds and hundreds of sharks. They were darting around in frenzied swarm. It created a frantic, edgy energy that we all felt. It was like a fear somewhere deep and primal. And the oldest priest, he gestured to the sharks and said, "Our ancestors." "How'd you get the sharks here?" we asked. John's translated. He says he just goes to the water's edge and calls their names. He must remember the name of every past priest for generations. You see, when a priest dies, he becomes a shark. Now, we give the ancestors a feast, the old man said. A butchered pig was behind us, and the younger priest loaded the offal into the small canoe with him, and he took a stroke out and he dumped it into the water. And the water around the canoe went totally white with a frenzy, and I mean a boiling frenzy. I thought that canoe would go right over for sure. Brave man, I thought. But I see the trick. Butcher a pig, throw some blood in the water, tell the foreigners that you call the sharks. Big deal. The young man came back on shore. And the older priest, he says, now I wash. He was covered with blood from the butchering. And he walked waist deep into that water where minutes ago had been a wild feeding frenzy. And someone from our group shouted, stop him! Enough! Another said, for God's sake, no killing to satisfy our curiosity. And the old man just laughed, and he walked waist deep into that lagoon. And he bent down, he started washing blood off himself. And the sharks darted all around him, but he remained completely untouched. Then he walked in the water around the point and got out on the other side. And nobody could believe that he wasn't torn to pieces. I sighed relief. Whew, what the? He came over and he calmly lit a cigarette. Weren't you afraid, someone asked? Why? These are my ancestors. They would never harm me. Now, come to our temple. And we walked to the simple pandana shack. And inside were rows and shelves, and on those shelves were human skulls. Row on row of them. The ancestors, the past priests, and someday I will be here, he said proudly. Well, we all mulled around for a while, watching the sharks, some smoking with the old men, some wandering the islet. Then eventually we got back into the inflatables and went back to the ship. Before nightfall, we weighed anchor, shot the reef pass out into the clear ocean water, and with a sigh of relief, we left Langa Langa Lagoon behind. With the eye of the wind, we sailed into the night, onward ever, on to the next bizarre place Captain Tiger Tims would take us, another clipping from some old National Geographic. Now, 30 years later, I still think about the shark callers of Langa Langa Lagoon, and I wonder. It's a mysterious and wonderful world. And sometimes real life is stranger than fiction. And sometimes it defies explaining. And we humble creatures, we need only to accept, not explain. Thank you.
Okay, let's give Wayne another big round of applause for a great story out there. Thank you, Wayne. That was awesome.